Hi, everybody. So today's episode is episode 2 of the podcast. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the history and also about some gender fandoms that come across in Game of Thrones. So, first off, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Game of Thrones, right? So, Game of Thrones actually originated from the book, which the TV show is based off of. And George Martin is the author, George R. Martin, is the author of the Game of Thrones book. And, with the episodes, we're going to kind of dive a little bit more deeper into how each season and certain episodes and certain characters are pinpointed in certain ways. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, the history of Game of Thrones started from the book of George Martin. And it was set in a time, I want to say 300 years after the first character introduced in the book, who is Aegon the Conqueror, who started the House of Targaryen. And jumping into the Game of Thrones history and what, per se, like each season progresses into the history of Game of Thrones. So, starting with episode 1, really pinpointed was the House Stark, which was in the north region of the realm, and it really highlighted the main character, who later on in seasons is you kind of see his character at its highs and at its low, and that character is Jon Snow. So I kind of want to talk about a little bit more of the gender roles and the fandoms, right? So Game of Thrones definitely uses a lot of language and images, and they also kind of used the male presentation really dominant. So a lot of like the lords and the kings are males, but they also don't shy away. They don't, in a way, silencing the woman's voice, because later on in the seasons, spoiler alert for those that probably haven't really watched Game of Thrones, the queen starts to kind of take over the King's Landing. And I don't want to get too in depth on that, because we would touch more so on how that affected the whole series in a later episode. But a lot of the masculinity and the femininity in Game of Thrones kind of pinpoints and bounces around certain characters throughout the season. Because in the beginning, you get really, in the first few episodes, and maybe even season 1, you get a lot of male presence. But coming into season 2, you start to realize the females and the women in this TV show actually hold such a great balance and such a great authority in the TV show series. And I think the way George Martin also wrote the book pinpoints that as well. And it shows a lot of how he wanted to show the presence of female and masculinity and femininity in his books and TV as well. So Game of Thrones really, I think, showed a lot of gender personalities with each character, right? Because even later on in the series, you start to see that there is a knight who really shocks her. Her name is Brienne, and she was a fierce, very strong and passionate knight, but she was a female, so a lot of the male characters did not take her very seriously, but I like the way that they showed the dominance that she had in the series, and showed her to become a very important knight. So the last character I want to touch base on, who showed a lot of gender role, was Arya Stark. And Arya Stark was a lady of House Stark, and she was taught and brought up to be a lady, and she was quite opposite of that, and she was fierce. I think her character developed over the seasons, and it showed a lot of how Game of Thrones can take the traditional ladies and sirs and lords and also show their vulnerability. That sometimes, you're born into something that you don't want to be. You're born into a certain role, give or say, that you don't want to be, and you don't want to associate with as much. And I just love the way that George Martin and the Game of Thrones producers really showed that through the seasons. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you once again for listening to the GOT podcast. B1.